Okay, for the sake of time, it's 2 o'clock, so we'll kick off this next session. Dr. Sheila French is presenting on assessing high risk and high needs individuals. I will let her introduce herself in a bit more detail. We assume that people have read the bios in greater depth, but she can give a brief intro as to some of her background. I do want you guys to know we'll leave about 5 to 10 minutes for questions at the end of the session. The Q&A feature should work, so please use that to enter your questions. I will read them afterwards. And if that doesn't work, please put them in the chat and I will catch them there. Before we get started, I would like to give a land acknowledgement. I do want to acknowledge that we are on Turtle Island, home to many Indigenous peoples and has been since time immemorial. I express my gratitude to the lands I am moderating today, which are the traditional lands of the Siksikaitsitapi, which is the Blackfoot people, including the Siksika, Kainai, Piikani, and Amskapi Piikani. I also recognize the Tsuut'ina, Stoney, Métis, and other nations that now call this place home. So Sheila, take it away.
Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming and spending this next hour with me. It is a beautiful sunny day here, so not only am I fortunate to get to chat with you, I'm looking out my patio doors at my beautiful garden. So I can't imagine a better place to be right now. Let me get started up here and I'll tell you a little bit about myself. Okay. I want to go here. Chelsea, you'll let me know if you can see my title slide there.
I can see it.
Good. Okay. So Sheila French, I have been working, researching, teaching, training, and correction since about 2000-ish. Coming down to the end of my career, I think, and time to pass the torch. My students are now becoming my teachers, which is always a point in someone's career that's gratifying for sure. So experimental psychology, I've done some research into what works to reduce reoffending. I started out at the University of New Brunswick at the Center for Criminal Justice Studies there, and then realized pretty quickly on that if I wanted to have some credibility, if I wanted people in the field to actually use my research, I should probably get some experience in the field so I could understand how my research fits and how it might have to be adapted. So I spent a few years with the Ministry of Corrections, Public Safety and Policing, that's what it was called at that time, in Saskatchewan, and worked with a team of clinical directors there to do some training, implement some programs, and do some research. So now I'm at Lethbridge Polytechnic. We just found out today that we were gifted or given Polytechnic status by the province. So I'm with Lethbridge Polytechnic, and I've been here about 10 years. Okay, so I want to give my own little land acknowledgement. I am really honored that I get to work on Blackfoot Confederacy land and in the tradition of the Siksikaitsitapi with, I have to say that my students who live on these lands and work on these lands, my Blackfoot students, are going on to do some of the most amazing work in our community and within their own community. So again, the teacher is now being taught, so I love that. So what works is a moniker that is sort of focused around a certain area of research. And this is not new to anyone, I'm sure, sitting out there listening to this. We can apply what we're learning in research to practice. And we can make our decisions using research, and we can also use evaluation to make sure we're having the intended effects. The things that we want to happen are actually happening. So that's what I mean by what works, making sure that we're using effective correctional interventions. We know a lot of stuff already. I'm going to introduce you to someone here. I asked one of my colleagues, a lot of my colleagues at the college are former law enforcement officers. And so I asked one of my colleagues, tell me about, someone that police knew about that was really a prolific offender, because we're going to talk at the end of this about chronic offenders, prolific offenders, high-risk offenders. And they told me about this particular person that they knew of who had committed, I think it was upwards of 150 break-and enters in our industrial park over the space of about 5 years. He was extremely prolific. And so the reason I asked about that was I thought to myself, what I can only talk here about what I know. I am an expert in a very narrow number of things. And so here's what I know and what we, the royal we, in terms of corrections research know. We know about the risk, need, responsibility principle. I know you had Jessica Faladay talk about that with you this morning. Chelsea, I know I'm going to mow your grass a little bit here for your presentation tomorrow, but I really do need to go into it in order to set the context. So we do know these three principles, very, very valuable. We know how powerful cognitive restructuring is. We know that the way to help people, especially, folks coming from with an addictions background, you cannot give up an addiction without changing how you think about everything. People, places, things, situations, your use, everything. So cognitive restructuring is an important key. We also know a lot about what we need to train our correctional employees in so that they can participate in reducing reoffending. And so some of the things I'll talk about today are risk assessment. We'll spend a little bit more time on the risk principle. Correctional practices, which are core training skills for frontline employees. Relapse prevention, which again, coming from an addictions background, it's a really, really important piece. And the concept, we won't spend a lot of time on motivational interviewing. I'll talk about it very briefly. So this is what we know. And we know a lot more than this. The field knows a lot more than this. I'm not privy to everything. Our agenda today, 3 topics, and then a really, hopefully, a discussion around the risk principle and how it might fit with drug treatment courts. So the first topic, I always start this talk with a story. The concept that history repeats itself. And this is always just to remind me and folks that I'm talking to about how there was a long period of time when it was not about helping people to rehabilitate. And so we'll talk about that. We'll also talk about the misconception that punishment is going to reduce crime rates. And so we'll talk about why, from a psychology, behaviorism perspective, that might not be the case. And then we'll get into a few things around what does work. So we'll talk about effective correctional intervention. We'll spend time on R&R, core correctional practices. We'll talk about a concept called dosage very briefly. CPAI is the Correctional Program Assessment Inventory. It's a way to periodically assess my corrections program, unit, institution to make sure that all of the pieces are in place to have recidivism reductions. And then we won't spend very much time at all on relapse prevention. Okay, so let's start with this story. I don't know how many of you have heard of a researcher by the name of Robert Martinson. If we go back to the early 70s, the picture is New York City. I don't know how many of you have been to New York, but you know that Times Square is a huge tourist destination. That was actually a strategic plan. Back in the late 60s, early 70s, the mayor of New York, the governor of the state, decided that they wanted to clean up Times Square. It was a mess. Prostitution, drugs, gang involvement, gambling, all illegal, of course. And so they decided that they wanted to clean it up. They realized that that meant they were going to have to put a lot of people in jail. And what they had the foresight to think about at that time was, what do we do with them? If we want to rehabilitate them, if we want to have them become productive citizens, what kind of programs do we need to have? So they went to City University, New York. And they met with these three researchers, Douglas Lipton, Robert Martinson, and Judith Wilkes. Actually, they met with Lipton and Wilkes first. And they said to them, tell us what kind of programs we need to have. So Lipton and Wilkes started to do a literature review. Martinson comes on a little bit later. He is a very charismatic researcher. He wants to be famous. He comes from a background of controversy. And so anyway, the three of them are doing this literature review, and they did what we call they were just starting, and they were doing what we call kind of a vote counting. They would collect a study and they would put it in a pile. The studies were all about programs given in institutions, correctional institutions, and whether or not they reduced reoffending. If they did, they would put it in one pile. If they didn't, they would put it in another pile. And what started to happen was the pile with programs that didn't work started to get pretty large. The pile with programs that did work was slower, but there were some studies there. They were just starting to read through these studies, just starting to talk about publication when Robert Martinson was approached by a neoconservative magazine / journal called The Public Opinion, and they asked him for a preview. And so he did. He wrote a piece without the knowledge of Lipton and Wilkes, and he published it in 1974. And this is what it was called: What Works? Questions and Answers About Prison Reform. Sorry, Public Opinion, or Public Interest it was called, not Public Opinion. And here was his conclusion. With few and isolated exceptions, the rehabilitative efforts that have been reported so far have had no appreciable effect on recidivism. So let's just think about that for a second. If you're being told, think about the time period that this happened in. Think about the early 70s. Some of you may be, it may be long before your memory begins, but for some of us, we knew that the times at that period had lots of chaos, civil rights issues, feminism, violent and property crime waves were really high in the early 70s. That's why I had to clean up Times Square. Political scandal was ongoing. Gas was scarce, and what there was extremely expensive. There was lots of controversy over the Vietnam War, riots at Kent State University, protests, Attica prison riots. It was just a mess. And so when Martinson came out with this conclusion that nothing works to rehabilitate people, people already had a mistrust of the government. It didn't matter which side of the political spectrum you fell upon. This was a conclusion that you embraced. And so it took hold really strongly. So I have a question. Think about it. We can maybe talk about it at the end. If the conclusion from top researchers is that rehabilitation doesn't work, what do you do with people who are justice involved? This is the period of time in the US, you start seeing legislation around 3 strikes, you're outlaws. You see legislation around mandatory minimums. I remember reading about a man in California who had 2 violent priors, was released from prison, stole a pizza off of a food truck, and ended up going back to jail for 15 years. And so their prison population between the early 70s until today grew to about 2.3 million. There's about 2.3 million people incarcerated in the US right now. So if people can't be rehabilitated, then maybe the answer is to get tough on crime. And that's definitely what started to happen. So let's talk. We're just going to step aside from that story for a minute. We'll come back to it, but I just want to talk a little bit about punishment and what the research says could happen if we just sanction people for criminal behavior. So this is a meta-analysis. Meta-analysis collects all studies on a topic and kind of averages the outcomes for each study. So Dr. Jim Bonta from Public Safety Canada was where most of his career was. He collected in 2004, this was the tally that he gave me. He collected studies on whether or not there was a service, some kind of service that was given during the supervision of a client, or if they just got a court sanction. So what you see over here on the top, let me just get a laser pointer up here. So you see this variable here. There was a sanction given, but there was also some kind of service. Now, they didn't specify what type of services. It could have been anything in the spectrum. It could have been, addictions. It could have been talk therapy. It could have been just about anything. And so in their literature review, they found 273 studies where the sample was given a service plus some kind of a sanction. Then there were 101 studies where the folks in the samples were just given a court sanction. There was no documented service. I don't know how many of you recall what a correlation is. I'm just going to really briefly talk about what an R or correlation is. A correlation is a statistical association between two variables. It can have a value of 0, which means there's no relationship between the two variables, or it can have a value of 1, which means there's a perfect relationship. Every time you see one variable, you also see the other. Or it can be anywhere in between. For this particular condition, where the people in the samples across these 273 studies got a service plus a sanction, on this graph, as you go up, it's a reduction in recidivism. What they saw across these 273 studies on average was when the people got a service plus a sanction, there was about a 12% reduction in reoffending. Nothing to sneeze at. 12 out of every 100 crimes ends up being erased. It's a good outcome, something to build on. What they found across these 101 studies where the people in the samples got only a sanction was an actual increase of about 3%. We don't want to do that. We don't want to create 3 crimes when we don't have to. So this was kind of the beginning in the early 2000s of understanding the importance of not just punishment. A study also done around that time was by Paula Smith and Claire Goggin and Paul Gendreau around different kinds of sanctions. If sanctions overall aren't where it's at, are there sanctions that we can look to help offer some reductions in reoffending? Again, as you go up on this graph, it's reductions in recidivism. What you can see here is that for both adults and youth, if you give more prison sentences versus community, you can actually increase recidivism. If you give longer versus shorter sentences, we can actually increase recidivism. There is a little bit of hope for intermediate sanctions like electronic monitoring. They may offer some reductions in reoffending, but overall, what we're doing, if we're just giving sanctions alone, it's very rare that there's just a sanction alone. But again, just some early research that gives us caution when we talk about the usefulness of punishment. So the question then becomes, why doesn't punishment work? I don't text and drive because I don't want to hurt anyone. I don't want to get a fine. I don't want to have my car taken away or all of those things. Punishment works for me. The threat of punishment works for me. In order for punishment to work, and forgive me if this is something that you've all seen before, but I just think it's important to set the stage because I ask students every semester, what do you do with people if rehabilitation doesn't work? Well, you have to give them longer sentences. Well, you have to put them in jail. Well, you have to breach them. And so again, in order for punishment to work, and this comes straight from the behaviorism, B.F. Skinner, operant conditioning, Albert Bandura research, it has to be of maximum intensity. I always think of my little girl. She was 3. I'm cooking in the kitchen, and she looks up and she sees the pot on the stove, and she sees the beautiful red colored coil burner. She says, "Mommy, pretty." And she reaches her little finger up and she touches it. That's maximum intensity. She never touched that burner again. Next thing that has to be in place in order for punishment to be effective is it has to be immediate. If you think of our court system, there's backlogs, there's ways that things can be delayed. And so punishment is very rarely immediate. It comes at some other point. If you think of my little girl touching the burner on the stove, that is immediate. Punishment also has to be consistent. It has to be immediately follow every time I engage in that behavior. We know David Farrington out of the UK, in one of his longitudinal studies for the youth that he followed well into adulthood, 50 years, they reported committing 22 crimes for every one they got caught for. So it opens up that idea, well, maybe I won't get caught this time. So punishment, in order to be effective, you have to be consistently caught every time. There has to be no way that I can have charges plead down or thrown out. And this concept of reinforced alternatives is a very important one. First of all, I can't escape the consequence for the punishment to be effective. And I also can't find a reinforcement in that behavior. Think of the gang clients that you've worked with. In the beginning, that reinforcement from their peers is far more rewarding than any kind of sanction or punishment that the criminal justice system or the courts can give them, because that just puts another notch on their belt. That just is more rewarding. So there can't be any reinforced alternatives. There can't be anyone cheering me on for my criminal behavior that I find important. And then finally, the costs have to outweigh the benefits. Kind of goes back to the maximum intensity. I say to my students, how many of you still text and drive? Be honest with me and tell me. And there's still quite a few, even though they know that they could be hit with a fine. The cost of that fine isn't prohibitive to them. So these are all of the things that have to be in place for punishment to be effective. If you think of our criminal justice system, I don't know if we could ever fiscally, financially be set up to do any of this. Yet we still expect sometimes, and I say we now, I'm thinking the public, do expect an element of punishment from our criminal justice system. We think of deterrence, we think of general deterrence. And so if we can't build in, oh, sorry, I missed one. The punishment has to be aversive to the individual. If I've got lots of money, a fine for distracted driving is not aversive to me. If I am, a single mom with 2 kids and I don't have an income, then perhaps that's going to be much more aversive to me. A lot of our clients have really thick skins and they've been beat around for a long time, whether it's at home or by friends or, during their addiction. And so punishment is just not as aversive as it should be. So these are what need to be in place. Who does punishment work with? If it's not working for the clients that we work with, it's working for those people who are future oriented, those people who are not impulsive. And this comes again straight from behaviorism. This isn't from me. This is definitely Albert Bandura and B.F. Skinner. It works with people with average to above average level of cognitive functioning. It works for people who have a minimal punishment history, so that consequences actually make them uncomfortable and they don't have this bring it on kind of attitude. And it works with people who are not thrill seekers, people who are not impulsive, and people who are not prone to boredom. I don't know about you, but the vast majority of justice involved folks that I have worked with in my career don't fit into a lot of these boxes. And so if it doesn't work for the people that we want it to work for, we certainly can't rely on it. If it doesn't work for all of the people we want it to work for, we certainly can't rely on it. Why doesn't it work? Because it only tells me what not to do. It doesn't tell me what to do differently. It doesn't address criminogenic needs. Sentencing usually is closely related to index offenses, and it relates to a behavior, not the root or the cause of that behavior. And it doesn't offset the immediacy, the frequency, and the magnitude of the rewards. Immediacy simply means if I need money, I can go and shoplift anytime I want, sell what I've stolen, and get some money. I can do that frequently, as often as I want to. And sometimes I can score something really big when I'm shoplifting. And so sanction doesn't offset those things as an important behavior for me. Okay, so let's go back again to Martinson for a minute. So Robert Martinson, these two piles of studies, as you can see, one is larger than the other. A whole group of researchers started to react to this conclusion of his that nothing works. One of them was Ted Palmer. He worked out of University of California, and he went through all of the studies that Lipton, Martinson, and Wilkes had collected, and his conclusion was, listen, sure, there's a number of studies here that a lot of studies here that say that the programs didn't work, but there's a good sized pile here that says that they did. You have what are sometimes referred to as the Canadian School of Psychologists. Some of you may know Dr. Paul Gendreau, Robert Ross, Don Andrews, Steve Bonta, Steve Wormuth, Jim Bonta. These are the Canadian psychology researchers who said, wait a minute, we grew up in the behaviorism tradition. We believe people can change behavior. We have seen lots of correctional clients change their trajectories. We're not buying this, that nothing works. And so they started to really, what they called, look into the black box of corrections. You can see stuff go into the box, black box referring to like supervision, jail. You see people go into jail, you see them coming out. What do we need to have in the middle so that when they come out, they're further along, they're more productive than when they went in? And so they started to do their own research. And through that research, we have learned so much. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to just look at the three primary principles that I know Jess talked about this morning, and I just want to kind of bring them from my perspective and the way I think about them. The first one, of course, is called the risk principle, and this says two things. The first thing it says is if you want to assess risk, you have to use a valid and reliable risk assessment tool. There are a number of them out there. I did my entire PhD dissertation looking at risk assessment tools for general responsivity. I did a meta-analysis back in 2009 with my two colleagues, Dr. Gendreau and Dr. Campbell, and we looked at risk assessment tools for violence. There are a lot of choices out there. Why do we want a valid and reliable tool? Some of us get pretty good at judging or deciding who is going to reoffend and who isn't. We need a tool that we're able to defend. I remember working with a woman in Saskatchewan. She was a correctional officer. She said, Sheila, I don't need all of this risk assessment stuff. I read auras. And if your aura is red, you're going to reoffend. And I'm never wrong, she said. And so, there's a lot of folks out there who, and sometimes she was probably right a lot of the time, whether she was reading in an aura or pulling from her wisdom as a youth correctional officer. I suspect it was the latter, and she was probably right. But we really need to be able to defend these tools and the use of these tools. And so we need a valid and reliable risk assessment tool. And the second piece of the risk principle is that the intensity of the intervention should match the level of risk. What I mean by intervention is two things. There are two pieces. The first piece is what we call risk management or supervision. So the level of risk management should match a person's level of risk. And the second piece of an intervention should always be risk reduction. So the level of risk reduction should also match the person's level of risk. And what this means is greater intensity intervention, risk management, and risk reduction for higher risk clients. And these intensive interventions may actually increase, and it's been documented so very many times that they do and can actually increase level of risk for lower risk clients. So that's the risk principle. We're going to look at a little bit of research about the risk principle in a minute. The second principle is called the need principle. And here we want to target for change dynamic risk factors. We now, instead of risk factors, when we talk about the need principle, we're calling them criminogenic needs. And these should be no surprise to most folks. If you look at this list of 7 things here, you will see that they are really closely related. Think of your clients. How many of them have pro-criminal attitudes? It's okay to commit crimes in some situations. So-and-so deserved a punch in the face because they insulted my girlfriend. A lot of them have pro-criminal associates or peers. This pro-criminal or antisocial personality profile is someone who is impulsive. They can't control their emotions. They're manipulative. They're just a really combustible kind of personality. This extends back in their history to probably their childhood. It's every situation, so it's across contexts. They're just that really volatile, impulsive kind of personality. As you know, substance abuse can be closely linked to reoffending, family marital relationships, whether or not they have come from or are surrounded by supports in their family or their intimate relationships that hold them accountable for their behavior, or are they surrounded by folks who are permissive or just don't care about their behavior, or maybe they're surrounded by family or intimate relationships that are also pro-criminal. Education and employment is often measured by whether or not a person has a job or how much people have worked in the last year. I believe the intent of this particular factor is to also understand how the person thinks about education and employment as a way to get ahead in life. If they do not think that working at McDonald's, how many youth I said to them, what'd you think of getting a job at McDonald's? No way, Sheila, that's bullshit. I'll only make $12 an hour. I can make more than that doing B&Es. So it's how they think about education and employment that is also important to measure here. And likewise, how they think about their leisure, spare recreational time. What do they do with that time? Do they hang out on the street corner with their buddies, smoking pot or passing around a bottle of Wisers? Or do they engage in a sport or hobby or volunteer or those kinds of things? So these are the 7 dynamic criminogenic needs that are very closely related empirically to reoffending. These are very, very important to target and to prioritize over non-criminogenic needs. So a non-criminogenic need can be just about anything in a person's life. Self-esteem was the big one when I started in this field. Every offender underwent a self-esteem program. Self-esteem has not been shown to be closely related to reoffending or to reduced recidivism, but it was something that lots of resources were invested in, and it was not getting us reductions in recidivism, nor should it, because there's no empirical relationship there. A non-criminogenic need can also be any of these 7 that a client has not demonstrated risk in. So using substance abuse as the example, if substance abuse does not play into that client's offense pattern, it is not a criminogenic need. Lots of folks have substance abuse issues, but they don't go out and do B&Es. So at that point, it's a non-criminogenic need. I'm not saying it's not important. I'm saying it's not a criminogenic need. It might fall in the third principle, and the third principle is called the responsivity principle. Again, this has two pieces. The first piece is called general responsivity. It's been shown if you want to change behavior, the best method to learn new behaviors is using cognitive behavioral, social learning kinds of interventions. We have to target, I just have to move my camera here a little bit. We have to make sure that we are helping people change their behavior. We have to make sure that new skills are structured for us and mentored by other people, that we are building working relationships with people who are pro-social or don't engage in the behaviors that we're trying to change. So general responsivity is a very, very important concept to make sure that we build in to our work with justice clients. The second piece, individual responsibility.
Sheila, I don't know what happened to your mic, but I can't hear you.
Perfect. Thanks, Chelsea. I just moved my camera there, or my little video, and so I hit the wrong button. So did you hear general responsivity? You did. Okay, so specific responsivity really is attention to the individual. What do I need to know about this person sitting in front of me in terms of their strengths, in terms of their areas where they need improvement, in terms of functioning issues, so that when I'm building a case management plan for this person, I'm setting them up for success. Two of the biggest responsivity issues that correctional clients have is motivation to change. How many times in Saskatchewan did case managers say to me, oh, I don't spend any time with John because John doesn't want to change. Meanwhile, John is a really high-risk client, engages in a ton of crime when he's in the community. He is exactly the client that needs intensive case management intervention. And so the responsivity issue there is if John is not motivated to change, I start working with John in a way that's going to just help increase his motivation. Start building a working relationship with John. Start, just talking about what change might look like. Working through the stages of change in my mind, using motivational interviewing. So motivation is really one of the biggest barriers to our ability to help our clients change. And as you know, substance use is another huge barrier. It might be a criminogenic need. It might not be. It might be a responsivity issue. Chelsea has told me about her stage phase one. Phase one is just making sure that this client is situated on a solid footing, physically, mentally, emotionally, situationally, so that they can start to engage in change. At that point, it's addressing it as a responsivity issue. So it's important that we understand these things. So these are the three principles. There are more. There are 16. I spared you the others, but if you're interested in those, I'd be happy to go through them with you at some point. Okay, so that's, let me see if I can, there we go. Let's just do a couple of quick slides on, Chelsea, I'm just gonna, listen, you're gonna trust me. You're gonna trust me that the research is there. I have studied it for over 20 years. Over and over and over again, we see these three principles. I'd love to go through this research, but I just don't think we'll have time in the time that's remaining. Again, I have not found very many studies that don't support the risk, need, responsivity principles. So I'm just going to ask that you bear with me, and we'll come back to that if you're ever interested. I am always available. Okay. So one of the things that I learned when I did go to the field and I worked in Saskatchewan was the importance of a case management model. And I'm borrowing this from Saskatchewan. Those of you that work in Saskatchewan, this will look familiar to you. It's the case management model for institutional and community corrections. And so here's the way it looks. When I have a client come onto my caseload, that person has a level of risk. Might be low. It's never zero. Because they've already had a conviction. So they have a level of risk, and that level of risk corresponds to a threat to the community. What we want is that through our time with them, we're able to manage and reduce that risk. And if we can do that, we're able to decrease the threat to the community. The question then becomes, how do I structure my case management? What goes in between those 2 points in time that is going to get me that goal? And assessment has to be a part of that. So in Saskatchewan, they train 3 types of assessment. There's an assessment of a person's risk factors and criminogenic need factors. There's an assessment of their offense pattern, or what's called an offense pattern analysis. And then there is a responsivity assessment, so that they clearly understand in the early stages all of the important pieces to working with that client. That assessment then feeds into what's called it's a safety plan in Saskatchewan. It's a risk management plan and a risk reduction. In terms of risk management, what types of external controls does this person need to have in the beginning that is going to prevent them from engaging in crime? A jail is a risk management strategy. Perhaps the person's risk is so high and their offenses are really cause a lot of harm, and a period in jail is absolutely necessary to increase public safety. In the community, within jail, there are risk management strategies. There's lockups, there's counts, there's all of that kind of thing. In community, risk management looks like conditions, curfews, all of those kinds of things. At the same time, as we're working with someone and we have all of these external controls, we're starting to work on risk reduction. Risk management and risk reduction kind of work in tandem. As I'm working with someone over a period of time, I see them putting the work into risk reduction. I might ease up some of these risk management strategies for a little while. Then if I see them start to engage in risky behaviors, then I can say, uh-oh, better put a little more risk management in place for a little while. And so again, this is how Saskatchewan conceptualizes it. Alberta has their own conceptualization of the case planning process. I teach that in my classes. This was just a simple one that I think it certainly demonstrates the importance of looking to research for all of these pieces that go into this middle part. Okay. Staff training. This is another important one. This is making sure that my staff have the skills, my case managers have the skills to be able to help clients change their behavior. Saskatchewan, again, I borrowed this from them. This comes from research by Craig Dowden and Don Andrews. It's been shown to be supported in research ever since the early 2000s. There are 2 types of skills that your correctional staff should be trained in. Interaction skills. These are quick skills that I can use just in the moment with a person to be able to start to build a working relationship with them, to be able to start to point out behaviors that might not be acceptable, or clients who are late to supervision appointments. Or I remember we had a client who Body odor was a huge issue, so we used effective disapproval for that. So these are just quick skills that you can use on the go with your clients. They don't require a sit down. They don't require a meeting in terms of a case management meeting. And then there are intervention skills, and these are your case manager trained skills. Effective modeling, structure. All skills should be structured. Teach your clients how to problem solve versus solving their problems for them. And again, we can train our case managers to engage in cognitive restructuring. It's not a difficult skill to learn, and it's certainly, for me, was a very satisfying way to interact with clients. Okay, so again, in the interest of time, if you want more information about these, I can certainly point you to how Saskatchewan trains them, and I can talk a little bit about them myself. So again, from this black box, we want to make sure that there's staff training. Dosage. Think about it. If you go to the doctor with a mole that is changing shape and maybe it's bleeding a little bit, and your doctor looks at it and says, this is stage such and such skin cancer. Your cancer stage is going to determine the intensity and the frequency of your treatment. There's research starting with Carter and Sankovitz in 2014 that says the same thing about diagnosing or assessing level of risk, that there are treatment dosages for correctional clients based on their risk level. And so low risk, moderate risk, and you see high risk dosage target, 300 plus hours, that is actually achieved with high risk sex offenders federally. We don't normally provincially have clients for that long institutionally, but federally they certainly do. And a lot of our probationers will have longer sentences as well. So that's a lot of treatment. It really is just testament to the fact that there is no magic pill. It's a lot of hard work on the part of the case manager and the client. Okay, so evaluating programs, I won't spend a lot of time here, but there is a tool available which can help you evaluate your drug treatment courts if your goal is recidivism reduction. I can point you in the right direction if you're ever interested in learning more about that tool. Those who have used the tool, past research has shown 25% reduction in misconducts in institutions and 17% lower recidivism rates with good scores on the correctional program assessment inventory. Relapse prevention, I think I'm probably preaching to the choir here. Anyone with a background in addictions understands the importance of high-risk thinking, feelings, situations, and behaviors, and your client understanding those. I'm saying it's not just for substance abuse anymore. It's for any kind of chronic offending. And so there's lots of research that says, for example, you can get 15% reductions in recidivism for clients who have a good RP plan. So there's that. Now we'll just spend a few minutes. Chelsea asked me for a few things in this, and it became much more complicated than I thought it was going to be. So what I have here are really just some things, some food for conversation. The first thing is there's this thought out there, and I've seen it a lot of times, and I went looking for support for it, and it's definitely there, that a small number of individuals is responsible for a good proportion of crime. Some say as the majority of crime. You've heard these called chronic offenders, prolific offenders. One study out of the UK, which I thought was a delightful moniker, felonious few, the power few, violent offenders, high risk offenders. So small number. There's lots of research for support. I know that there are conversations happening on the drug treatment court level. Should we take higher risk offenders? Should we take violent offenders? There's a lot of conversations to be had to operationalize this. I've read studies in the last few days that talked about total crime volume. Do you designate someone as a chronic offender if they have 150 B&Es behind them? Or should we be focusing on total crime harm? I might have 153 B&Es, but they've all been industrial park where the big companies have insurance. Is this the same as someone who is causing physical crime harm to people? Should we focus on both? So there's conversations to be had about that. Chronic violent clients versus chronic nonviolent clients, or should the focus be on both? Should there be a focus on generalists? Some say that people who engage in a whole bunch of different kinds of crime are likely more harmful than folks who are specialists. Sorry, that's not true. Have higher recidivism rates than folks who are specialists because the specialists are usually sexual offending or violent, physical violence. Careers can naturally escalate or de-escalate over time. So if you take someone into your program and they are an older age, of course they're very motivated. They might have aged out of crime naturally, even without the programming. So talking about crime career escalation and de-escalation, and there are certain periods of time that are important there. Is there a fit for the risk principle and the risk assessment in drug treatment court? Because a lot of provinces, that's not true either. All of the provinces have valid and reliable risk assessment tools. And so the question for me, and maybe for you, then becomes, is that provincial territory? Do we let the province take care of risk assessment and then drug treatment court becomes part of the case plan? It's a good question. And then Chelsea and I did talk a little bit about cost benefits of the status quo versus change. I spent a couple of days looking and I didn't come up with anything that was usable here. Again, it's one of those comments that I hear floating around in research circles that say, oh, there's huge cost benefits. I would say if you are interested in bringing or chronic, high risk, or even violent offenders into drug treatment courts, that there be a partnership with an economist who can help you put some dollars to that. So that's an interesting thing to think about. So just some thoughts, food for thought there. When you're treating high risk clients, as you already know, I'm sure, high reward if they are successful, lots of challenges. Case management becomes really, really time consuming. They often are very resistant to change. So there's a lot more patience needed on the part of case managers to build relationships, help the person work through the stages of change, use motivational interviewing. There are lots of considerations for risk management and risk reduction. They have higher numbers of administrative charges like breaches, not showing up for appointments. So, is it even feasible to keep a high risk or violent client in the community? Does there need to be some kind of a partnership with a custodial context in that case? Lots of attrition. Because there are lots of responsivity issues with high risk clients, there might even be that antisocial personality kind of profile. They just can't engage. And I saw this in a project that I did with Lethbridge Correctional Center. And so we can talk about that at some time if you're interested. Okay, so that's all I've got. Happy to hang out here later on a sunny Tuesday afternoon with you all past the time. I don't know if there's another talk after mine. I don't even know if anybody's still here. Maybe they're all gone. Maybe you've all left.
There are people here. So if you do have questions, please put it in the Q&A or the chat and we can work through those. We've got 5 minutes for sure, but if we need to hang out longer, then we can do so.
Again, this is all just to spark conversation. Who am I to tell people in the real world doing this work how they should be doing it? All I can tell you is what the research says. And then, how that might fit. It's been my experience that people working in corrections do their best. People making the decisions do their best. It's not always possible to incorporate these things. I do see something in the chat there, Chelsea.
Very insightful. Thank you.
You're welcome. Who was that, Chelsea? What's that person's name?
Ada? I hope I'm saying that right.
Thank you, Ada. There you go. Geez, maybe we should go back and do some of those studies and that stats. I'm just kidding. Everybody loves, graphs and statistics. Well, I do. I don't know if anybody else does, but it's great. Oh, I see something in the Q&A again, Chelsea.
Oh, my understanding is that addictions can be equal to the top 4 factors combined. Is that your knowledge as well?
Robin, I have not heard that. My guess would be this: if the person has a long criminal history and they have addictions, then they likely have developed some pro-criminal attitudes. Maybe they do have lots of pro-criminal peers. And so through addressing their addictions, some of those criminogenic needs get reduced as well. But I haven't seen that particular. And if you've got something, I'd love to see it. If you've read something, send it my way so I can see it. And thank you, Robin.
Oh. Some research from the Center for Court Innovation, blanking on the exact number. And I know for people that attended the US conference, Dr. Doug Marlowe had indicated that substance use was the #1 criminogenic need. And so I would just be mindful of not to discredit that, but that is information floating out there too that.
Yeah. Honestly, again, like I said, I'm at the point in my career where there's a lot happening. And so new things are learning. If there is research that I can expand my understanding of, I would love to see that. So send it my way.
Oh, not from Doug. Okay.
Yeah, I have not heard that. So again, substance abuse treatment, you target your thinking. You sometimes have to change friendships. You learn how to control your emotions. There's 3 criminogenic needs right there that are being targeted: pro-criminal thinking, peers, and pro-criminal kind of impulsive personality. So if there are reductions in recidivism from just targeting substance abuse, I suspect that they're also targeting other things as well. That's my guess.
Any last minute burning?
And if not, I just want to say you guys are on the forefront here. You are doing amazing work and you're helping a lot of people. So I have to applaud you for that. And if there's any way that I can help, I would be thrilled to do that. I'm going shopping in about a minute and a half.
Okay, so if there's one last quick question or comment, if not, I think these presentations will be shared and I think contact information as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Contact me if you have any questions.